The temperature had already dropped to minus 22 degrees when Marta Voss pressed her bare palm flat against the barn floor and felt something that stopped her cold. Warmth, not the kind you imagine when you're half frozen and desperate. Real warmth, steady, patient, rising through 6 inches of hard-packed Dakota earth as if the ground itself was breathing. January of 1887 had arrived in the Dakota Territory like a judgment, and 11 people were depending on a 31-year-old Bohemian widow to keep them alive through the worst winter anyone in Yankton County could remember. She had the underground room. She had built it herself across 6 weeks while 3 experienced men told her she was wasting effort on an idea that wouldn't work. The second wave of the storm was 48 hours out. The men who had laughed at her in October were not laughing now. This is the story of what Marta Voss built inside a barn that should have been impossible, designed on principles she'd learned from a grandmother she would never see again in a country she'd left behind forever. It's the story of why 3 capable homesteaders thought she'd gone wrong in the head, and what happened in 11 days when the mercury stopped moving and the only thing standing between 11 people and a Dakota winter was a room dug into the earth beneath a barn floor, packed with dried grass, and warmed by nothing more than the ground's own memory of summer. The earth below 4 feet, her grandmother had always said, keeps its temperature. Hot summer, cold winter, below 4 feet, the earth remembers neither. In January of 1887, that old woman's knowledge kept 11 people alive. Marta Voss had arrived in Dakota Territory in the spring of 1883 as the wife of Radoslav Voss, a man who believed in the Homestead Act with the fervor of someone who had read too many railroad pamphlets. They filed on 160 acres 4 miles southeast of Millard's Crossing, a settlement consisting of a general store, grain elevator, saloon, and post office, and Radoslav stood at the edge of their claim on the first afternoon with the expression of a man receiving a gift he'd earned. Marta stood beside him and said nothing, which was not the same as thinking nothing. Their first winter was survivable. The second was harder. By the 3rd year, Radoslav had a cough that deepened through December into something that frightened Marta, in the way sounds frighten you when you're 4 miles from help and the snow is 3 feet deep. He died in February of 1886, 11 days before his 34th birthday. Marta buried him in frozen ground she attacked with a pickaxe for 4 hours. Petra was 6 and watched from the soddy doorway with the expression of a child who has already learned that some things are simply true and weeping changes nothing. That left Marta alone on 160 acres with 1 draft horse named August, 3 milk cows, 14 chickens, a 2-year-old pig, and a mortgage on the barn. The summer of 1886 brought drought. Corn came in at 40% of expectation. She hauled the surplus to Millard's Crossing in September and got 17 cents a bushel less than she'd counted on because every other farmer in the county had done the same arithmetic at the same moment. By October, she had $31.40, 1 cord of split cottonwood, 2 months of provisions, and a clear-eyed understanding of her position. The old-timers had been saying since August that the coming winter would be different. Not bad the way recent winters had been bad, different in a deeper register. Elias Grunfeld, who farmed the adjacent parcel and had been in Yankton County since 1879, told Marta in September that he hadn't seen the geese leave that early since 1871. The winter of 1871 had put 2 families in the ground in Bonhomme County before March. Elias was 61, a Bavarian immigrant who expressed concern only when it was warranted. This winter, he told her in the last warm afternoon of September, squinting at the flat northern horizon, you need to not be above ground too much. Marta had been thinking the same thing, and she'd been thinking about more than her own survival. Because here was the situation. There were 11 people within 4 miles of her barn who were going to need somewhere to be when the real cold came. Herself and Petra made 2. Elias and his wife Hilda and his widowed sister Gertrude, who had arrived from Minnesota in August, still making up her mind about something, made 5. Per Lundqvist, his wife Sigrid, their 2 children aged 3 and 5, their hired man Cormac Daly, and a baby due in January made 10, and Sigrid was 7 months along when Marta ran these numbers. That made 11, if the baby was counted from conception rather than arrival, which Marta thought was the practical way to count it. Per Lundqvist's shelter was the problem. He was 29, Swedish, a fisherman's son who thought he understood cold, But the canvas and sod structure he'd built on his claim in June was not designed for a Dakota winter of the kind Elias was describing. His fuel supply was one partial cord of green cottonwood that would burn slow and damp and cold when he needed it to burn hot. Marta had looked at his setup in August and said nothing, because there are things a widow woman on an adjacent claim does not say to a man who hasn't asked. But she'd filed the information away. There was one structure large enough and well built enough to shelter 11 people through a sustained cold event. Marta's barn. The question was how to make it warm enough to matter. The answer came to her on the wagon seat in early October, riding back from Millard's Crossing with provisions she could barely afford. She was watching the frost on the north face of the creek bank, holding through 3 consecutive afternoons while the south bank stayed bare, when a memory arrived with the sudden clarity that old knowledge sometimes has when the right problem finally finds it. Her grandmother Bozena had maintained a podzemny komora in the hillside behind her house in Moravia, an underground chamber below the frost line, insulated in a specific way, drawing on what Bozena called the earth's own warmth. Not a root cellar exactly, though it served some of those purposes. A deliberate room designed around the physical fact that soil below 4 feet maintains a constant temperature regardless of what the season is doing above. Marta had helped her grandmother maintain that chamber as a child and understood its principles the way you understand things learned with your hands rather than your eyes. She wasn't thinking about root vegetables now. She was thinking about a newborn baby in January. Before she said a word to anyone, she spent 3 days in her existing root cellar with a candle and a measuring stick. She needed to know if what her grandmother had told her held up against what she could actually observe. The root cellar floor sat 4 feet 2 inches below surface level, with outside temperatures running between 18 and 28 degrees during the first week of October. The floor held at a consistent 44 degrees Fahrenheit. She checked it morning and evening for 3 days, marking each reading by notching a piece of kindling. The walls at the cellar bottom ran between 46 and 50 degrees. The ceiling dropped as low as 38 on the coldest nights. The floor was the thing. At 4 feet down, it was 44 degrees on the warmest day and 44 on the coldest, because it was connected to the deep earth. And the deep earth didn't care what the weather was doing. That constancy was what she was going to build from. She started digging inside the barn on October 14th. She had been at it 4 days, roughly 2 feet down across the full 8x10 footprint she'd laid out in the northeast corner. When Elias Grunfeld rode over to return a borrowed draw knife and found her in the barn with a bandana over her face, moving frozen earth one careful swing at a time. He stood in the door for a full minute watching her before she noticed him. "What are you doing?" he said. She told him everything. The principle, her grandmother's chamber, the temperature readings on the marked kindling stick. Elias listened with the careful attention of a man who has survived long enough to know that wisdom doesn't arrive in expected wrappers. He studied the notched kindling by candlelight for a long time. 44 degrees at 4 feet, he said. In normal winter, I think you're right. In bad winter, this winter, the ground temperature alone is not enough for 11 people. No, Marta agreed. But it's enough to build from. I'm not relying on the ground temperature alone. She showed him the rest. The framed walls planned for the south and west sides, the double wall construction with an insulated cavity packed with dried grass, the ceiling assembly. Elias listened with precise questions, and when she finished, he picked up a shovel without further comment and started digging. That was how Elias Grunfeld expressed approval, not with words, but with tools. The opposition came from 3 other directions, and it was not foolish opposition. These were experienced men with legitimate reasons for their doubts. Roy Buckmaster arrived 2 days later, ostensibly on a grain errand but clearly curious about what he'd heard in town. He was 44 years old, had farmed the eastern edge of the county for 8 years, and had survived everything the Dakota Prairie had offered through thorough preparation and a confidence in his own methods that was, up to this point, entirely justified. He stood at the edge of the excavation with his thumbs in his suspenders. "This is your winter plan," he said. "Part of it." She walked him through the design, the double wall, the insulation cavity, the ceiling assembly. When she got to the grass-packed wall gap, something in his expression shifted. "Dead air," he said. "Trapped air. My grandmother used it in Moravia for 40 years. He put his boot against a corner post, checked the sill plate. Moisture, he said. Come spring, below grade, you'll get seep. She described the drainage channel, cut at 3 degrees toward the south, lined with flat creek stones, covered with boards serving as the floor surface. Buckmaster studied this for a while. You've thought about this more than I thought you had, he said, and left without committing to an opinion. Per Lundqvist came by a week later, and his resistance had its roots in pride rather than technical doubt. He said his family would manage with improvements he planned to make. What's your fuel? Marta asked. 1 cord of green cottonwood, he said. She told him Elias had been farming this county since 1879, was helping build the room, and thought the design was sound. And the baby's due in January, she added quietly. Per looked at his boots. I know it, he said. He came back 2 days later with his hired man Cormac Daly, 23 years old and from County Clare in Ireland, where he'd grown up in a stone cottage with walls 3 feet thick. Cormac kept stopping to examine the wall cavity details, running his hand along the gap between the inner board wall and the outer sod, pressing the packed grass with his fingers. My father's cottage, he said once, not finishing the thought. Then, different principle, same idea. That was exactly right. The fourth skeptic was the most structural in his concern. Reverend Douglas Pemberton rode out in late October with Harold Fitch, and Pemberton, an Ohio man, seminary educated, and the son of a carpenter, knew what to look for in framing. He'd seen underground structures fail. He named a specific family, the Thorsons, whose dugout had partially collapsed in the spring thaw of 1885, injuring 2 children. Below-grade construction failed when the frost came out of the ground and the loads weren't right. 11 people in a structure that failed was not a theoretical problem. Marta walked him through the framing. 8x8 corner posts set 6 feet total below the barn surface, bedded in packed clay. Mortise and tenon joinery on the wall framing, cut by hand with the draw knife and chisel. 6x6 ceiling joists on 16-inch centers. Pemberton pressed against posts, checked the sill plates, crouched at a corner connection. Who taught you this joinery? He asked. My husband. Pemberton stood. He had presided at Radoslav's burial. There was a moment between them. He was a good craftsman, the Reverend said. He was. Help me finish it, or don't. But the structure will hold. Harold Fitch, who had said nothing through all of this, cleared his throat. I've got a load of dry prairie grass in my loft, more than I need. You want it for the wall cavity, I'll haul it over. Sometimes opposition resolves itself without anyone saying the word yes. If you've been watching this channel for any length of time, you know that stories like this one aren't in the history books the way they should be. The practical knowledge that kept frontier families alive, the accumulated wisdom of people who had no margin for error, is disappearing. The people who carried it are gone. The stories that held it are scattered across church records and account book margins and WPA interviews that nobody's looked at in decades. If you want to be part of preserving what's left, subscribe to this channel right now. Not because it helps our numbers, though it does. Because every subscriber is a choice to keep this knowledge alive instead of letting it vanish. We document these stories before they're gone. That work matters. The insulation cavity deserves a careful explanation, because it was the detail that made everything else possible, and the detail that most people who heard about the structure later either didn't understand or dismissed as too simple to matter. A standard frontier wall, sod, log, or milled lumber, works by providing a single thermal barrier between inside and outside temperature. Thicker means better, up to a practical limit. Sod walls 18 to 24 inches thick were standard on Dakota homesteads and worked reasonably well. But even a 24-inch sod wall couldn't hold against minus 38 degrees for 9 days, which was what Elias Grunfeld had experienced in 1873. What Marta had designed was different in kind, 2 thinner walls with a gap between them, packed with dried prairie grass. The outer layer was sod blocks, 16 inches thick, stacked and clay mortared, heavy and slow to change temperature, buffering against sudden cold drops. 2 feet inside that, an inner wall of 2-inch pine boards from Radoslav's lumber surplus. The 24-inch cavity between them was packed with Harold Fitch's dry prairie grass at approximately 12 pounds per cubic foot, dense enough to prevent convection, but open enough to maintain millions of tiny air pockets. Dry grass is, at its structural core, a collection of hollow silica tubes. Packed into a wall cavity, those tubes create dead air chambers too small for convection to operate. Air trapped in spaces that small can't circulate, and air that can't circulate can't carry heat from one place to another. The result is thermal resistance equivalent to what a later era would measure at R30 to R35. The performance of modern 6-inch fiberglass bat insulation with a layer of rigid foam board on top, assembled in 1886 from materials that cost Marta Voss nothing beyond the labor of packing them. Her grandmother had known this for 50 years. She had never called it R-value. She had called it the wall that breathes without letting cold in. The ceiling was similarly layered. Ceiling joists, then an inch of pine boards, then 8 inches of dry grass in a shallow frame, then sod blocks on top. 14 inches total, bringing the room's interior ceiling to 6 feet 2 inches, enough for everyone except Per Lundqvist, who stood 6'4" and would need to duck at the trap door. The floor was the bare earth itself, 4 feet down, at 44 degrees and holding. The drainage channel ran south at 3 degrees grade, lined with creekstone, covered with boards that served as the walking surface and allowed drainage to flow freely underneath. The entry was a trap door cut into the barn floor, 18 by 30 inches, hinged with leather, sealed when closed by a double layer of canvas stretched over a wooden frame and weighted with a section of sod. The weight created a pressure seal that reduced air infiltration through the entry to nearly nothing. Marta stood in the completed room on November 4th, alone with a candle, and checked the temperature with her marked kindling stick. 48 degrees, 4 degrees warmer than the root cellar floor, because the insulated walls were keeping the earth's radiant heat inside the room rather than bleeding it into the barn. The framing didn't shift when she pressed her shoulder against the posts. The ceiling was tight. She stood in that room for a long time, touching the grass-packed walls, looking at the joinery her husband had taught her, thinking about her grandmother's hands on similar surfaces in a country she would never see again. Then she climbed the ladder and went to cook supper for herself and Petra. She was as ready as she could be. She had been right about the winter, but she hadn't calculated correctly on the timing. The Lundqvists were already in Marta's barn by December 28th because Sigrid had gone into labor 3 weeks early on December 26th, and Per had come pounding on Marta's door at 2 in the morning with snow in his hat and the look of a man whose planning had run out. The baby, a girl named Ingrid, healthy and loud, the name Sigrid had been holding since summer, arrived at dawn on December 27th, born on the floor of the underground room with the temperature holding at 61 degrees, warmed by 4 adults and 2 cows Marta had moved in from the north end of the barn. 61 degrees in the room, 23 degrees in the barn above it, 7 degrees outside and dropping. Per came down the ladder when it was done and stood looking at his daughter and his wife, and then at the walls, and then back at his daughter. He didn't speak for a while. Then he looked at Marta. "I should have helped you dig in October," he said quietly. "You helped in November. It was enough." Elias and Hilda arrived on December 30th with Gertrude and what provisions they could carry before the roads closed. Elias brought his small box stove from the claim shanty, which he installed in the barn's south end on a sand bed with a length of stovepipe he'd had the foresight to bring. Roy Buckmaster rode by on the last day of December, allegedly to check on neighbors. Marta took him down the ladder. He stood in the room, 68 degrees with 6 adults and 3 children present, and turned slowly, taking it all in. He looked at the grass-packed walls and the earth floor and the sod ceiling and the trapdoor seal. He was quiet for a long time. "How long to build this?" he finally asked. 6 weeks of mornings, 3 full days at the end. He nodded once and climbed back up. He thanked her and rode home to his coal supply and his well-built soddy and 8 years of preparation. She watched him go without judgment. January 4th was the day the mercury stopped moving. That was how Elias described it. He checked the thermometer at first light, -22 to -25 degrees, the exact mark uncertain because the glass was old. He checked it at midday. The same. At nightfall. The same. The temperature had settled at the bottom of the scale and intended to stay there, and the wind was running 25 to 30 miles per hour out of the northwest. The conditions on open ground were what Elias described in a single word: unsurvivable. The 11 of them, Marta and Petra, Elias and Hilda and Gertrude, Per and Sigrid and their 2 older children and baby Ingrid and Cormac, settled into the rhythm of the room. They slept there at night, all 11 on blankets and straw ticks across the boarded floor. They spent the days in the barn, cold but functional, adequate for tending the 17 animals, adequate for the children to run from end to end under the watch of adults managing multiple simultaneous problems. The temperature in the room at night, with 11 people sleeping, ranged from 72 to 81 degrees Fahrenheit. On the 2 coldest nights, when the outside hit -25, the room reached 81, 11 people generating somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 BTUs per hour collectively, heat that the insulated room captured and held with the efficiency of something built to do exactly this. During the days with most adults upstairs, the room dropped to between 62 and 68 degrees. The earth floor held between 46 and 52 degrees throughout. It never dropped. Whatever the sky was doing, whatever the wind, the earth at 4 feet below the barn floor maintained its temperature, because the earth is not subject to weather the way the surface is. It has its own accounting. Infant Ingrid Lundqvist slept in a wooden crate lined with wool on the room floor and thrived. Sigrid told Marta in mid-February that she'd raised 2 children through a Göteborg winter and thought this was better. Not just bearable, but better. On January 9th, the stove cracked. A hairline fracture in the cast iron firebox, low on the left side, where the metal had been pushed past its limits. Elias found it in the morning inspection and looked at it for a long time with an expression that Marta had not seen on his face before. A failed firebox in these conditions was not a problem they could solve from inside the county. There was no replacement stove within 40 miles, and 40 miles in this weather was another country. Per Lundqvist had been standing behind Elias, looking over his shoulder. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "I've packed Oakham into worse than this." He was a boat builder's son, and what he knew about caulking under heat was not the kind of knowledge anyone here had thought to bring to a Dakota barn. He spent 40 minutes working through what was available: rendered lard, wood ash from the stove's own cleaning, shredded canvas from the room's door seal, and produced a mixture that he packed into the crack with a sharpened stick, working it deep and smoothing it flush. He let the stove cool for 1 painful hour and then brought the fire back up slowly, in careful stages, while everyone watched the crack and the room was very quiet. It held. It held that day and through the remaining 7 days of the cold snap. Per repacked it once more on January 13th when the edge showed signs of working loose. The barn was quiet while he worked, the same quality of quiet as the first time, the kind that means everyone understands what hangs on the outcome. Marta watched him work and thought about something an old bohemian neighbor had told her in Chicago. Each person carries their own store of winter against the cold. Some stores you can see in advance. Some you only find when the cold comes. She had not seen Per Lundqvist's store when she'd looked at his inadequate shelter in August. She saw it now. January 15th. The thermometer rose to 0 degrees Fahrenheit for the first time in 11 days. In context, it felt almost warm. Elias Grunfeld stood in the barn door and watched the flat white prairie and said, to nobody in particular, that the worst was past. He was right. By the 22nd, the temperature had climbed to 21 above and the roads were passable. The 11 days had produced the following results: 0 human deaths, 0 livestock deaths, 1 completed birth, 1 repaired stove, and an infant who had gained 4 ounces. Roy Buckmaster came by in late February to see the room in the daylight, now that the crisis was past and there was leisure for a proper examination. Marta took him down the ladder and left him there for a few minutes. When he came back up, he was quiet in the way of a man doing honest work on himself. 8 years farming this territory, he finally said. I thought I'd seen most of what there was to see about surviving a Dakota winter. I never thought of this. He paused. I thought of a lot of things. I never thought of this. My grandmother thought of it, Marta said, in Moravia, 50 years ago. Roy Buckmaster looked at the trap door and then back at Marta. Well, he said, your grandmother was considerably smarter than me. He meant it as a genuine tribute, and Marta accepted it as one. What Marta built has a name in the vocabulary of a later era, an earth-sheltered structure. The principle she employed, the stable below frost line temperature as a thermal base, high-performance insulation to prevent heat loss, and human and animal body heat as supplemental warmth, is not a Dakota invention. It is not a Moravian invention. It is a discovery that human beings have made independently in every cold climate on Earth, because the physical law underlying it doesn't change with latitude or century. The Icelandic turf house sheltered farming families through subarctic winters for 1,000 years using the same essential architecture: below-grade earthen walls, thick sod insulation, shared space for people and livestock. The pit house of the Pacific Northwest indigenous peoples, dug into the earth and roofed with timber and sod, achieved the same thermal result through the same relationship with the ground's stored temperature. The Loess Cliff cave dwellings of Shaanxi province in China, where 40 million people lived in naturally earth-tempered rooms carved from the hillside, represent the same convergence on the same truth. Below frost line, the earth is a thermal battery. It charges through the accumulated warmth of millions of summers, and it discharges so slowly that across 11 days of the worst cold snap in 45 years, the loss is essentially unmeasurable. Modern building science calls this ground source thermal exchange. Passive house designers in Germany and Scandinavia have applied the underlying principles since the 1970s, achieving heating costs 60 to 70% lower than conventional construction through insulation, thermal mass, and the Earth's own temperature. Earth-sheltered homes on the Great Plains today apply the same logic Marta applied in 1886 with hand tools and materials that cost her nothing but labor. The physics is identical. It will not change. Marta would not have found any of this surprising. She would not have claimed credit for the discovery, because she knew she hadn't made one. She had remembered something when remembering it was necessary, and she had built it correctly, and 11 people had been warm. That was the whole of it. If you've stayed with this story all the way to here, you're exactly who this channel exists for. What Marta built wasn't revolutionary, it was remembered. And the difference between those two things is the difference between knowledge that requires genius and knowledge that only requires preservation. What her grandmother knew, what she passed on, what Cormac recognized from his father's stone cottage in Clare, what Elias confirmed against 8 years of observation, that knowledge is worth keeping. Subscribe to this channel not because it helps our numbers, but because every subscriber is a vote for keeping this knowledge alive instead of letting it disappear. We document these stories before they're gone. That work matters, and it needs you to make it possible. Marta proved up her claim in 1888 and farmed it alone until 1902, when Petra married Václav Horacek, a second-generation Bohemian from 12 miles east. Marta lived with them until her death in 1921 at 66. The underground room served as emergency shelter for the next 4 winters, and by 1888, 3 more families in the county had built their own versions. Per and Sigrid Lundqvist left for Minnesota in 1895. Their daughter Ingrid, born in the room on December 27th in 61-degree warmth while outside it was 7 above and dropping, became a school teacher in Duluth and taught for 31 years. She told her students she had been born underground in a blizzard and had always thought that was why winter never frightened her. Cormac Daly filed his own claim in 1887, built a stone house with a wall cavity, married Nora Sheehan in 1890, and raised 6 children. One of his granddaughters, asked by a WPA researcher in 1937 about frontier building techniques, described what she called the grass wall trick as if it were the most ordinary domestic knowledge in the world. Elias Grunfeld's sister Gertrude married Harold Fitch in May of 1888. Nobody seemed surprised. The barn stood until 1923, when a windstorm took the roof off. Václav found the underground room exposed the next morning, framing solid, posts unmoved, the prairie grass in the wall cavity compacted to half its original depth but dry and preserved after 37 years. He pressed his palm to the earth floor, cool, steady, absolutely unchanged. He climbed back up and told Petra what he'd found. She wasn't surprised. Her mother, she said, had built things to last. There is something worth sitting with at the end of Marta's story, something the underground room keeps pointing toward even after the narrative is done. We live in a time that has, in certain respects, forgotten the relationship between human habitation and the earth itself. Our homes sit on the surface and fight the climate from above, burning enormous energy to maintain the temperature we want against the temperature the world provides. It works, and we have organized our entire built environment around it so thoroughly that most people alive today have never been inside a structure that drew on the ground's own temperature as a primary heat source. But the Earth is still there. It is still 44 degrees at 4 feet below the surface of Yankton County, South Dakota, just as it was when Marta Voss pressed her palm to the barn floor in October of 1886 and felt something rise to meet her hand. The thermal battery is charged. The knowledge of how to use it is available to anyone willing to look, in building science journals, in oral histories, in the margins of account books nobody's opened in 100 years, in the stories of women like Marta and grandmothers like Bozena, who understood, long before it had an official name, that the earth below frostline remembers what the surface forgets. The problem was never a lack of resources. The problem was always whether someone in the right place at the right time would remember enough to ask for them. Marta Voss remembered. 11 people were warm when the mercury stopped moving because she did. That knowledge costs nothing to preserve. It only requires someone to carry it forward, one story at a time, until the person who needs it most can find it. If this story meant something to you, like it and share it with someone who deserves to know what the earth remembers. Subscribe to this channel, not for our sake, but for the next Marta Voss, who is out there somewhere, pressing her palm against cold ground, waiting to feel something rise. The worst winter in 45 years ended in February of 1887. The grass came back in April as it always does, with the specific abundance of a world that has no memory of what it just put you through. Baby Ingrid Lundqvist turned 3 months old in warm air, squinting at the Dakota brightness with the focused attention of someone who has decided the world is worth examining. August, the draft horse ate new grass by the fence line and did not remember January at all. In the northeast corner of the barn, 4 feet below the floor, the earth held its temperature and waited. It was not waiting in vain.